Anyone who's ever visited those senior care centers thinks they know everything that goes on inside those walls. They don't know anything. I know because I lived there, and I walked out at the age of 89 to start living again. Lord, you young people, listen to me here. Never think that old age is the time when you sit still and wait for your children to take care of you. I am Frank Miller. I built houses for 45 years. My hands are calloused from concrete and wood, but my heart is still strong enough to recognize when I've been betrayed. Ruth, my wife, passed away 2 years ago. She left in her sleep, peacefully, just like everyone dreams of. We were married for 48 years. We paid off the old house in the suburbs of Greenfield for 32 years. That was the house full of the laughter of our grandchildren when they were little, the smell of cookies baking every Sunday morning. Susan, my daughter, who is 54 this year, sat across from me at the old kitchen table back then. She pushed a piece of paper toward me, her eyes looking down at the floor. The medical report said I had mild cognitive decline and could no longer manage my life independently. I looked at her, trying to catch her eyes, but she turned away. That was 2 years ago. The house, worth $425,000, the place where Ruth and I had poured our sweat and tears, now belonged to her just because of that piece of paper. And I was taken to Willow Creek Senior Care, 60 miles away from everyone I knew. My room was number 27, a single bed, a window looking out onto the parking lot, a TV mounted on the wall like in a hospital. I felt like I had already died from that moment. Have you ever wondered, when your children grow up, whether they will remember what you sacrificed for them? I remember clearly. Susan grew up with those evenings when I came home late because of overtime building houses for other people just so she could have money for college. Ruth used to say, "Frank, our daughter will take care of us when we're old." Now I know she was wrong. In the first days at Willow Creek, I still tried to stay calm. The staff there were kind, really. They called me Mr. Frank, brought food on time, and asked about my health. But that kindness was just their job. It wasn't real affection. Every morning at 6:30, the nurse named Betty knocked on the door. "Good morning, Mr. Frank, time for your medicine." I took the pills, looked out the window, and thought about the houses I had once built, with roofs strong enough to withstand storms. Now I was here, like a piece of furniture, forgotten in storage. There was an old man named Walter in the room next door. He had been a truck mechanic for 40 years. He sat by the window every day, his hands moving in the air as if he were tightening bolts. I asked him what he was doing. He looked at me, smiled sadly, and said he still knew how to do it, even though no one needed him anymore. That was when I understood. This place wasn't a home, it was a warehouse for people whose families no longer had room for them. I started writing down every day in a small notebook that I hid in my shirt pocket. Not to complain, I'm not the type to cry easily. I needed proof that I was still here, still thinking, still breathing. Day 1, it was raining. I wrote, "Today I miss Ruth making apple pie." Day 12, Susan called and asked if I needed anything. I told her I needed to go home. She was silent for a moment, then said the house had already been sold and given to someone else. I asked what she meant. She said she would explain later. She never explained. I sat there, my hands shaking, feeling like someone had poured ice water down my spine. My whole body went cold, my stomach twisted. Lord, that house was everything Ruth and I had. We paid the bank every single dollar, painted and fixed it up every weekend, planted trees. Now it belonged to strangers, and I was here like an expired product. In the days that followed, I observed everything like an engineer inspecting a bridge. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, everyone shuffling into the common dining room with dull eyes. There was an old lady named Edith who used to be a math teacher. Now she sat mumbling old math formulas to herself. No one listened. No one cared. I looked around and saw men like me, who used to be strong, now just skin and bones, sitting silently because no one listened to them anymore. That was when the real sadness hit, not loud anger, but a quiet sadness when you realize you were wrong about someone you trusted your whole life. Susan came to visit a few times, bringing yellow chrysanthemums, the kind Ruth hated. We sat for 15 minutes. She talked about her job, about the grandchildren, about traffic. I stayed silent. She hugged me at the door and said she would come back soon. But then the next month she didn't come. The month after that, neither. I counted the days, 412 long, endless days. Each day I felt myself fading a little more. like an image in an old mirror slowly disappearing. You all listening to me here, if you're reading these lines and you're still young, listen to this, old man. Start planning for old age right now. Don't think your children will automatically love and care for you when you're weak. Money, house, everything must have clear paperwork, and a lawyer must handle it. Don't let blind affection make you blind. I made the mistake of trusting that Susan would keep her word. She called the doctor, called the lawyer, and then people I had never met. I didn't know anything at the time. Only later did I learn how the biggest pains come to you, too late to fix. At Willow Creek, I learned that the staff's kindness was only management, not human warmth. They changed diapers, cleaned, but they didn't sit and listen to your old stories. I told Walter about the time I built my first house, when the roof leaked in heavy rain and Ruth stood below laughing and told me to fix it tomorrow. He nodded, but his eyes were far away. We were all waiting for something that would never come. I started tracking the staff's schedule like an old fox. At lunchtime, when the volunteers came to hand out books and newspapers, it was the most chaotic time. The staff were busy with paperwork, and no one was watching the doors closely. I didn't have a clear plan at first. I told myself I was just observing, but day after day the fear disappeared completely and I couldn't sleep. I lay on the plastic bed that creaked, thinking about Ruth. She once said, "Frank, we built bridges for other people, but we never built one for ourselves." Now I understand. I had built houses for hundreds of families, but I never built a plan for my own old age. Susan didn't call for 4 months straight. The last time she called, I told her I was fine. She asked where I was. I said at Willow Creek. She was silent. I hung up before she could say anything more. Have you ever wondered whether blood relatives are really trustworthy, or if it's just an excuse while they wait for you to become a burden? I now know the answer. On day 412, I decided, no more waiting. I put on the old jacket that Ruth had once patched for me, slipped the notebook into my pocket, and took the photo of Ruth from the bedside table. I walked out into the hallway during the chaotic lunch hour. The staff were busy serving food, and volunteers were chatting with a few residents. I walked as if I owned the place, because in 412 days I had never acted like that before. No one asked me anything. I pushed open the glass door, stepped out into the parking lot, and the cool wind blew in my face. My heart was pounding, but my legs still worked. I called a taxi from the payphone near the gate and told the driver to take me to the city library. From there, I found a notice on the community bulletin board, room for rent, Elm Street, Greenfield, flexible terms. I called the number. Diane, a 37-year-old woman, answered on the second ring. She asked how old I was. I said 89. Silence. She asked my name. Frank. She repeated it as if weighing it. I have a 7-year-old son, she said. The house isn't very quiet. I told her I had built houses for 45 years and I was used to noise. There was a longer silence. When can you come see the room, she asked. I said I was on my way. When I arrived at Diane's house on Elm Street, a small 2-story house painted light blue, she stood at the door with a surprised look. Charlie, the 7-year-old boy, peeked from behind his mother, his eyes wide as he looked at me like a strange creature. Diane had divorced 6 months earlier. Her ex-husband had cleaned out their joint account, leaving her with the mortgage and a pile of bills. She needed $800 a month in rent. My pension was enough to cover it and still have some left. We drank coffee at the kitchen table. I told her a few old stories about the houses I had built. She didn't say much, but her eyes no longer stared into space. Charlie handed me a stick figure drawing, an old man with white hair standing next to a little boy. That's you, Mr. Frank, my grandpa. I looked at Diane. She turned away, pretending to wipe the counter. At that moment I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of a new family, even though the neighbors started whispering. A woman named Carol across the street asked Diane straight out if she was taking advantage of the old man. Diane told her I handled my own finances, that I had driven her to the market twice last week, and that I had fixed the leaky faucet in the house. Susan called a month ago, the first time in 4 months. She asked if I was okay. I said I was doing great. She asked where I was. Elm Street, I said. With who? With my daughter, I replied. She got angry and started complaining. I told her I had to hang up because Charlie was waiting for me to help with his homework. There was a long silence. We'll talk later, Susan. I hung up, I am 89 years old. Every morning I wake up in the room I chose, eat what I want, and drink coffee with a woman who treats me like the father she lost when she was young. I have a 7-year-old boy who calls me Grandpa and pulls me to look at his drawings and tell him about school. The photo of Ruth is still on the new bedside table, still smiling like before. The worst thing about old age is not the slow body, but realizing who really loves you and who is just waiting for you to become an inheritance. I lived through 412 days of waiting to disappear, but now I'm not waiting anymore. I'm living one day at a time. Have you ever wondered whether the kindness of strangers can heal wounds that blood relatives cannot? I now know the answer. Life on Elm Street is not perfect. The neighbors still look at us with strange eyes and whisper behind our backs. But every morning when Diane makes coffee and Charlie runs downstairs asking for breakfast, I feel like I have never truly lived until now. I tell Diane about Ruth, about the houses I built, about my mistake with Susan. She listens without judging. Charlie asks me all kinds of questions, from how to hammer a nail to how an old man can still walk. I laugh and tell him, "Grandson, my legs are still strong because I never forgot to use them." That's the lesson I learned at Willow Creek. Never let anyone lock your legs, even if they say it's out of love. I still keep the old notebook. Every evening I write one line. Today I lived. Not existed, but lived. Susan called one more time, her voice sharper. She demanded to know exactly what I was doing with that woman. I told her Diane was my daughter, in her own way. She hung up. I wasn't angry, I was just sad. Sad because she never understood that family isn't blood, but the people who stay when you need them. Diane and Charlie stayed. They needed me and I needed them. That's the simplest truth. I often think about the days at Willow Creek, about Walter and Edith, about the people still stuck there. I hope someone will hear my story and change. You all, if you have elderly parents, don't wait until they get weak to care. Sit down and have coffee with them today. Ask them about their past, about the dreams they once had. Don't let them become a burden just because you're busy. And if you are old like me, remember, you still have the right to choose. Your legs can still walk. Don't wait for anyone's permission. In the first days at Diane's house on Elm Street, I felt like I had been born again. Every morning I woke up earlier than Charlie, went down to the kitchen and brewed a pot of strong black coffee, the kind I had been drinking since 1962 when I was a young construction worker. Diane was shy at first, but then she sat at the table holding the hot mug, her eyes less tired. We didn't talk much, just quietly listened to the birds singing outside the window. Charlie would run down with messy hair and ask me to tell stories about the houses I had built. I told the boy about the time I fixed a roof during a big storm in 1978. The wind blew all the tiles off, and Ruth stood on the ground yelling for me to come down right away. The boy laughed hard and said Mr. Frank was so cool. My heart felt strangely warm. Lord, I had forgotten what it felt like to be needed like this. But life isn't always smooth. The neighbors started whispering louder. Mrs. Carroll across the street often came over on the excuse of borrowing something, her eyes glancing at me as if I were a strange item. She whispered to Diane that an 89-year-old man living with a young woman, what was going on? Diane smiled awkwardly and said I was like a second father to her. But I knew those words were spreading around the neighborhood. One time I was fixing the back fence, hammer in hand, my back aching a bit from old age, when Mrs. Carroll walked by and asked loudly, "Mr. Frank, are you okay? Or is Diane making you do chores?" I stopped, looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Mrs. Carroll, I'm fixing this because I want to, not because anyone is making me. I've built hundreds of houses. My hands are still stronger than many young people's." She blushed and walked away, but I knew the rumors didn't stop easily. Have you ever wondered whether the whispers of outsiders can shake a newly built home? I now understand clearly. Susan started calling more often. The first time after I moved in, her voice was as sweet as sugar. She asked if I was okay and if I needed money. I said no, I could take care of myself. She was silent. Then her tone turned sharp, demanding to know exactly who I was living with. I briefly told her about Diane and Charlie. Susan laughed scornfully over the phone and said, "Dad, what do you think you're doing? You're being tricked." I didn't argue, just said, "Daughter, I'm 89 years old. I know how to tell who's real and who's fake." She hung up. But 2 weeks later she called again, this time her voice trembling, saying her lawyer said they needed to check my health status. I laughed loudly and told her, "Susan, do whatever you want, but I'm not going back to Willow Creek." That was when the tension really started to escalate. I still kept the habit of writing in my notebook every evening. Not to prove I was still sharp, but to remind myself that I was living. Today it's sunny. Charlie learned how to hammer a nail. Today Diane smiled more. Those scribbled lines helped me stay awake during the long nights, thinking about Ruth. She must be smiling up in heaven, saying, "Frank, you old fool, you finally learned how to build a bridge for yourself." I helped Diane clean the house and taught Charlie how to read old maps I had brought from the old days. The boy called me Grandpa Frank, and every time I heard that, my heart felt 10 years younger. But then one afternoon, Diane came home with a pale face. She had lost her part-time job at the cafe because her shifts were cut. The mortgage was still hanging over her. I sat down, took her hand, and told her not to worry, my pension was enough to cover it. She cried and said, "Mister Frank, you don't have to carry this for me." I smiled and said, "Daughter, I've carried things my whole life. Now caring for this new family makes me happy, not burdened." The pressure from Susan got worse and worse. She sent a letter by mail with a copy of the old medical report from Willow Creek. The letter said her father was being taken advantage of, and the court needed to intervene. Diane's hands shook as she read it, but I stayed calm. I told her, "Child, I waited 412 days in that place. I know how to handle this." I called my own lawyer, an old retired man like me named George, who had been an old friend from my building days. George laughed over the phone and said, "Frank, you're still stubborn as ever." He helped me prepare documents affirming that I was mentally competent and managing my own finances. But Susan didn't stop. She hired a private investigator to watch me, and one day I saw a strange car parked in front of the house. My heart pounded hard, but my legs stayed steady. I walked out, knocked on the car window, and said, "Buddy, go tell Susan that Dad is still here and Dad is happy." The man looked embarrassed and drove away. Have you ever wondered why children can turn their parents into strangers just because of one piece of paper and a little money? I have lived through it, and I advise you young people reading this, start planning for retirement today, sign clear documents, and don't let emotions blind you. I made the mistake of trusting that Susan would keep the silent promise she made to Ruth. Ruth once said before she passed, "Frank, we built bridges for the world, but what about bridges for ourselves?" Now I'm building it day by day with Diane and Charlie. Those evenings we sat watching old movies, Charlie falling asleep on my shoulder, Diane making hot tea. I told old jokes about the time I dropped a hammer on my toe in 1965. Ruth bandaged it and called me an idiot. The whole house laughed loudly. That was family, not blood, but the people who stay when you need them. Then the climax came on a hot Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the porch fixing Charlie's old bicycle, sweating, when Susan's car suddenly stopped in front of the house. She stepped out wearing a serious suit, followed by a young lawyer with a cold face carrying a folder of documents. Susan looked at me, her voice trembling but firm. "Dad, I've come to take you home. This place isn't safe for you." The lawyer pulled out papers and said the court could force me back to the care center because of the old report. Diane ran out from the house, her face deathly pale. Charlie hid behind his mother. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on a towel, and looked straight into Susan's eyes. "Daughter," I said, my voice calm but as solid as the concrete I once poured, "I'm not going back. I spent 412 days at Willow Creek. I know it's a warehouse, not a home. You took the house from your mother and me. You didn't call for 4 months. Now you come here demanding to take me back because you're worried about me, or because you're worried about the assets." Susan's face turned red, and she started arguing back that Dad was being tricked and Diane and Charlie were taking advantage of him. I cut her off, raising my voice just enough for the neighbors to hear. "Susan, I love you, but you made me disappear. I'm not angry. I'm sad. I built a house so you could go to school. Your mother and I paid off the debt for 32 years, and you pushed me into room 27 like a discarded object. Diane and Charlie are not taking advantage of me. They gave me a reason to live." The lawyer tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand and said, "Be quiet, this is a family matter. Susan, if you really love me, sit down and have coffee and listen. Don't bring a lawyer." Charlie ran out, hugged my leg, and cried, "Grandpa, don't go." Susan's eyes glistened with tears, but she turned away. The lawyer shook his head and said we would see each other in court. Then they drove off. I stood there, my legs shaking a little, but my heart strangely light. Diane hugged me and sobbed. I stroked her hair and said, "Child, I'm okay." That was the biggest decision of my life, not escaping from Willow Creek, but standing up and speaking the truth to my own daughter. That evening, Lawyer George called back, confirming that the paperwork was solid and we won. Susan stayed silent for 2 weeks and then didn't sue anymore. Life on Elm Street continued. I taught Charlie how to draw simple house plans. Diane found a new job, close to home with better pay. The neighbors gradually stopped whispering, and Mrs. Carroll even brought homemade cake over to apologize. I have no regrets at all. From an old man fading away in room 27, I am now Mr. Frank to Diane and Charlie. Every morning I wake up and thank God that my legs can still walk and that I haven't forgotten them. I advise old people like me. Don't wait for anyone to save you. Save yourself. Make plans and find people who truly need you. And to you young people, call your parents today. Sit and listen to their old stories. Don't let them become a burden just because you're busy. I still keep Ruth's photo on the bedside table. She smiles as if nodding. I am no longer someone waiting to disappear. I am truly living. What do you think about my story? Like, if you find it worth thinking about, subscribe to hear more real stories from old people like me, and comment below to share your thoughts or experiences.